lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. I think Alinsky's purpose in placing such a provocative statement at the beginning of the book is to repel certain readers. For example, I think many close minded Christians would see that statement and immediately close the book and never look back. Anyway, let's continue reading. Today's generation is desperately trying to make some sense out of their lives and out of the world. Most of them are products of the middle class. They have rejected their materialistic backgrounds, the goal of a well-paid job, suburban home, automobile, country club membership, first-class travel, status, security, and everything that meant success to their parents. They have had it. They watched it lead their parents to tranquilizers, alcohol, long-term endurance marriages or divorces, high blood pressure, ulcers, frustration, and the disillusionment of the good life. They have seen the almost unbelievable idiocy of our political leadership. In the past, political leaders, ranging from the mayors to governors to the White House, were regarded with respect and almost reverence. Today, they are viewed with contempt. This negativism now extends to all institutions, from the police and the courts to the system itself. We are living in a world of mass media which daily exposes society's innate hypocrisy, its contradictions, and the apparent failure of almost every facet of our social and political life. The young have seen their activist, participatory democracy turn into its antithesis, nihilistic bombing and murder. The political panaceas of the past, such as the revolutions in Russia and China, have become the same old stuff under a different name. The search for freedom does not seem to have any road or destination. The young are inundated with a barrage of information and facts so overwhelming that the world has come to seem an utter bedlam, which has them spinning in a frenzy, looking for what man has always looked for from the beginning of time, a way of life that has some meaning or sense. A way of life means a certain degree of order where things have some relationship and can be pieced together into a system that at least provides some clues to what life is about. Men have always yearned for and sought direction by setting up religions, inventing political philosophies, creating scientific systems like Newton's, or formulating ideologies of various kinds. This is what is behind the common cliche, getting it all together, despite the realization that all values and factors are relative, fluid, and changing, and that it will be possible to get it all together only relatively. The elements will shift and move together just like the changing pattern in a turning kaleidoscope. Okay, let's stop right here. First of all, I want to talk about definitions because words are so important. I will always emphasize that point. So, the first word that I think people may or may not be familiar with is the word panacea. And according to this dictionary here, it means a remedy for all diseases, a universal medicine, a cure-all, hence a relief or solace for affliction. So basically like a universal prescription for a problem. The next word is bedlam. Apparently this word comes from the word Bethlehem, and it means a hospital for lunatics, or a scene or state of wild uproar and confusion. Okay, now let's go back and discuss what we have read so far. Keep in mind that the generation he's talking about is from the 60s and 70s. This book was published in 1971, but I think it's just as applicable today. He says today's generation is desperately trying to make some sense out of their lives and out of the world. I think young people especially are always trying to do that. As a teenager, we are just beginning to do that. Adolescents, after years of public schooling and hopefully home training, come online in a sense when they start to have strong feelings of right and wrong. and they begin exploring that. They begin reading or expressing themselves or forming groups and talking to other people their age and trying to figure out what the hell the adults in the world are doing and why is the world the way it is. I think that many people have rejected materialism in some ways, but not in others. They realize that life isn't all about money and cars and trying to do better than their neighbors and all of those ideas. They recognize that this is not the way. That's not how you achieve a fulfilling and happy and full life. But in other ways, they're not able to let go of the programming that they received as a child. We are not able to let go of a lot of our programming. I don't mean to exclude myself when I'm talking about these issues, because we all have things that we do, certain habits that are ingrained into us that we are not even aware of. It usually takes either deep contemplation and exposure to different ideas, or it takes an outside observer to point out our flaws or our bad habits or our programmed ways of thinking in order for us to realize it and become aware of it and start to change and move away from that. But in order to do that, you have to have something else to migrate to. You have to have a different idea that leads you along, sort of guides you like stars in the sky. So, for example, for myself, I reject this idea of materialism as a way of life. But we're all human and we all have material needs and material desires. So he goes on to say that people have watched materialism lead their parents to tranquilizers, alcohol, long term endurance marriages or divorces, high blood pressure, ulcers, and so on. So basically, here he's talking about materialism leading to the problems that we still see today: obesity. How many adults are overweight? How many children are overweight? How many people are on serious, hard, dangerous, damaging drugs? I think many people who defend the materialistic status quo or any status quo do not see the connection between ideas and their inevitable consequences, because every idea is like a kind of vessel. It's a shape that has definite angles and a certain number of sides and a certain width and height and dimensions. And regardless of what your opinion of that idea is, it still has some type of definite shape to it, which means that if you start to pour content into it, if you pour liquid into it, it's going to fill up in a certain way. And at a certain point, it could swell, it could overflow, it could break the container. Any number of things can happen. But to the keen observer, and especially to like a philosopher, people who have really studied ideas as objectively as they can and are not trying to push a dogma, they can predict what is going to happen in a generation or two if people maintain this idea, if people really stick to it and follow it as it is written down. Then it's going to lead to certain definite consequences. If you live in a flood zone and it starts to rain and it doesn't stop, at some point your area is going to be flooded, and it's predictable. Now, maybe the scientists or the analysts don't get it exactly right. Maybe they say it's going to flood within 48 hours, but it doesn't do it for 72 hours, or it doesn't do it until next week during the storm. The point is that if the rain continues, it's going to flood in your area. So you need to make preparations to get out of there or to protect yourself if you're going to stay. He goes on to mention the disillusionment of the good life. Now, I remember in high school being taught about the disillusionment that followed World War I. Former soldiers, as well as civilians, felt a sense of disillusionment, disenchantment, and the teachers and the textbooks always described it negatively as if disillusionment was a bad thing. But what this word means is to free from an illusion. So that means for some time, many people believed in many lies, lies upon lies, layers of lies, and the war and the events related to the war took away those illusions. So there was this lifting of the veil, so to speak, like an apocalypse. And it showed them that basically all that nonsense that they believed before was not true. And they didn't know how to deal with it. War is a racket. War is a scam. It's probably the worst thing that you can subject a nation of human beings to. It's one of the worst things that you can do to them. And World War I was no exception. You know, with all of these wars, the reasons that are given to go and invade a country or to send troops over to fight, they're always based on deception, half truths, and sometimes just made up stories. And I find it incredible that so many men were willing to leave their farms, leave their families, leave their children and their wives just because somebody came on TV or on the radio or the newspapers told them that some boogeyman far, far away is going to destroy them if they don't sacrifice themselves and their families to the state. That is despicable, and it still goes on today. Many Americans will find any excuse why the United States corporation must go bomb and kill and rape and pillage some other people. And they never support the cause of peace and true freedom. They respond to the people who want peace as if those people are doing something destructive and violent themselves, when really the warmongers are the ones committing the crimes and doing the damage. The author goes on to use the phrase unbelievable idiocy of our political leadership. I don't think I really need to say much more about this one, but I will. To me, the very idea of having one supreme leader that rules over hundreds of millions of individuals is ridiculous. And I don't see the United States, meaning the land and the people, not the corporation, I don't see the United States improving significantly until we abandon some of these old, ridiculous ideas. There are lots of people on the internet discussing the illegitimacy of government. And the person I really admire is Larkin Rose. You can find him on YouTube. His name is Larkin Rose. And he also has a book called The Most Dangerous Superstition. But anyway, let's get back to Rules for Radicals. He says, we are living in a world of mass media which daily exposes society's innate hypocrisy. Now, I think that the mainstream media now, it does expose hypocrisy, but it does so by being hypocritical, not by conducting news reports that expose hypocrisy within the media or any other field of life. They do it by being hypocritical themselves and serving as the example. So I wonder sometimes about their ratings and how they're able to track, how many people view their shows, CNN or Fox or MSNBC or any of those. I wonder what portion of the population takes them seriously and what portion uses them as comedic relief. Next, the author goes on to say the young have seen their activist participatory democracy turn into its antithesis, nihilistic bombing and murder. So think about that in the context of war. Do the people ever get a vote on whether their government goes to war or not? Or is it decided by other people who are above us? They get to decide because they're wise, they're all knowing, they have the intelligence, and they have our best interests at heart. They're like the mother and father, and regardless of what we think, they get to do what they want to do and order us around. So if the average person has no say so in their government's affairs, can you really say that it's their government? If you're in the driver's seat, but I can legally come along at any time I want and take that vehicle away from you, in what sense is it yours? It seems very clear that that vehicle never truly belonged to you. Continuing with the reading, in the past, the world, whether in its physical or intellectual terms, was much smaller, simpler, and more orderly. It inspired credibility. Today, everything is so complex as to be incomprehensible. What sense does it make for men to walk on the moon while other men are waiting on welfare lines or in Vietnam killing and dying for a corrupt dictatorship in the name of freedom? These are the days when man has his hands on the sublime while he is up to his hips in the muck of madness. The establishment, in many ways, is as suicidal as some of the far left, except that they are infinitely more destructive than the far left can ever be. The outcome of the hopelessness and despair is morbidity. There is a feeling of death hanging over the nation. Okay, so let's go back to everything is so complex as to be incomprehensible. Yeah, I think it will be incomprehensible, especially after someone has been subjected to 12 or 13 years of public schooling and then 4 or 5 or 6 years of college so called education after that. Yeah, everything is going to seem incomprehensible because the curriculum was designed to deceive you, to mislead you into a certain way of thinking so that you will support the system, support the machine, and not question the fundamentals. What sense does it make for men to walk on the moon while other men are waiting on welfare lines or in Vietnam killing and dying for a corrupt dictatorship in the name of freedom? First of all, no one has ever walked on the moon. There's no evidence for that. It seems that if society wanted to solve a lot of these basic problems, that it could have easily done so many years ago if the people were acting together, if we were conscious and working together. But I get what he's saying here. He's saying, what sense does it make to have all of these technological advances when people in the society are still suffering and still struggling to meet their basic needs? There's this great contrast in the United States between people who are basically killing themselves, making themselves sick from abundance. So people eating themselves to death and getting fat and having diabetes and all type of issues. And on the other side of that are people who can barely get enough food in their bellies at night. And not only is there this gap between overindulgence and starvation, but then there are other people who are actually going out to these wars, killing people, doing all sorts of destructive things with technology. And we're supposed to be proud of that as Americans, and we're supposed to continue funding it, most importantly, to continue this important work. The lasers for laser guided missiles must be top of the line, state of the art, no matter what. He says, man has his hands on the sublime while he is up to his hips in the muck of madness. He's questioning man's priorities. There's all this destruction all around us that people are actively participating in, but at the same time, they're wondering, gee, I wonder what the problem is. I wonder why this is happening. Well, it's happening because you're standing in muck. You are encouraging the other people around you to come stand in the muck with you, and everyone is standing around up to their hips in filth and wondering why everything has gone to shit. And then the last sentence of this paragraph is, there is a feeling of death hanging over the nation. What do you think about that in 2021? What type of feeling do you think is hanging over the nation right now? Okay, here's the next paragraph. Today's generation faces all this and says, I don't want to spend my life the way my family and their friends have. I want to do something, to create, to be me, to do my own thing, to live. The older generation doesn't understand, and worse, doesn't want to. I don't want to be just a piece of data to be fed into a computer or a statistic in a public opinion poll, just a voter carrying a credit card. To the young, the world seems insane and falling apart. Again, this book was published in 1971, but I think the information that he's talking about here is very relevant for today in 2021, especially the part about being a piece of data to be fed into a computer or a statistic in a public opinion poll. Think about that in relation to the algorithms that we hear about that are used by technology companies to collect and analyze our data and our behavior with the purpose of manipulating us. These people very openly write in their books and publish in their documents the type of future that they foresee for human beings. It's not in our favor, it's not with our interest in mind. So when he says to the young, the world seems insane and falling apart, I wonder how teenagers have responded to the events that have been taking place for the last year and a half or so. That's not really perspective we get to see in the mass media. Children are forced to go along to get along. They don't have a say so in the rules that have been implemented. The adults get an idea in their head, they adopt a theory or a practice or some sort of remedy or a panacea, and they go with it. And the children just have to follow along, whether they like it or not. There are families all across the United States and across the world that have been torn apart by this nonsense. I saw a picture online recently of a group of family members hugging each other while wearing a plastic bag over their entire bodies. I think there was one, I think it was the boy, or one of them, they didn't have the plastic bag on, and the other family members were meeting with him, apparently, and they're so scared and worried that they were willing to put a bag over their entire bodies to hug this person who they claim to love. I think there's a huge amount of child abuse and child neglect in this country in a more subtle form than what we see on the TV and in movies. And what I mean by that is, of course, every parent has a right to enforce their rules on their children. It's their house. The children are children, they aren't adults. They can't support themselves, so they have to listen to the parents. absolutely reasonable. But when the parents do something and enforce a rule on a teenager, for example, that is unreasonable, and I know this term is, it might be subjective, but if what they're doing is unreasonable and oppressive and very aggressive and trying to control that other human being's behavior and even their thinking over the long term, that has serious consequences. Even if what the parent is saying is right, if that child, that teenager, does not understand the reasoning, he doesn't understand it in his own mind, and the parent, because they're in the authoritative position, so they feel like they don't have to really explain it to the child, if they maintain that attitude, that is, I, I think that's a form of abuse, because that messes with your mind. As a teenager, you have all of these feelings, you have these hormones going, you have your parents telling you things, your teachers are telling you things, your peers are telling you things, you see things on TV, you watch movies, you come into contact with all different type of ideas. And if that person's experience is that they're living under basically a dictatorship or an oppressive kind of regime, if that's the way that they feel about the situation, then that's something that needs to be addressed by the parents. You can't just hold on to the old school attitude of saying that you have to do what I say, not what I do. Basically, what I say goes, and you never explain it. That is terrible and terrifying. I experienced that throughout childhood, and especially as a teenager, once I started to think and have my own ideas about these things. And I thought that I should be able to discuss that with my parents. And I thought that if I was wrong about something, then the adult in my life would be able to explain why it's wrong and show me a better way, because I thought that's what parents and adults are supposed to do. That's the type of relationship that is supposed to be maintained between an adult and a child. This attitude of blindly obeying authority is why people are in the situation that they're in right now. Last year, so called experts came on the TV and said that you have to do this, this, and that. And people just rolled over and obeyed. They didn't question it, or if they did question it, the answers didn't affect their behavior. They just followed along with it anyway and gave strangers the benefit of the doubt over how to govern their lives. The conditioning for this master slave relationship begins with the parent to child relationship. And by the time that person is an adult, they're quite obedient and willing to obey whoever has the loudest voice, even without the threat of some kind of physical punishment or coercion. Even without that threat, many people, or perhaps most people, will still just do what they're told without even raising a finger or a voice in dissent. And like I said, it all begins in childhood when your father tells you, you have to do what I say because I said so, and that's the end of it. Okay, maybe when you're 3, 4, 5 years old, that works, but as a human being grows and his brain develops and he starts to think for himself, he naturally has questions and he has to be guided not by because I said so, but by reasons and understanding. Otherwise, you create a mixed up individual. You're creating confusion, you're creating anger and frustration, and it's not good. It carries over into adulthood if it's not solved in childhood. If the parents and the child never have those deep, open, honest, emotional conversations about beliefs and behavior and experiences, if that never takes place, if certain problems are not reconciled during childhood, then it's going to carry over into adulthood for sure. And it's going to manifest in some kind of way. Wow, I've been talking for 30 minutes already, and I'm not even 1/4 of the way through with this prologue. But it's a start, and I'll continue reading on the next.